Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. We are here and we are going through the amazing book. You've had 6 different reasons to buy it, and now we're going to give you number 7. For those of you that might be feeling a little sloth out there, Dr. David Salomon, the book is called 7 Deadly Sins, and we are talking about sloth. Would you like to maybe have a little opening monologue or intro to people who may not be familiar with you?
Sure. So, not familiar with me. So I'm currently director of undergraduate research and creative activity at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia, and I am a scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature, religion, and culture, and have written a bunch of books. Most recently, this book on the 7 Deadly Sins. I am originally from New York City, and very happy and grateful to George for this very nice series of interviews that we've done about this book, and coming to an end here with the 7th sin, and then we'll tie things up next week. But I think the sin of sloth is one of the ones that people are perhaps most confused about because they don't know what it is, and it is an interesting one because the definition for it has changed over time. Basically, we think about sloth as being laziness, and that's not entirely accurate, because there's a question of whether or not the engaging in this sin, if you will, is an active pursuit, or is it something which happens? And this is where the real debate comes in regarding the definition as being also sadness and depression. And we can talk more about that.
Yeah, you mentioned in your book that I think it was Pope Gregory who conflated the two. And that's a pretty interesting story. Would you mind starting with that one?
Sure. So Evagrius Ponticus, who's really the monk who we credit with coming up with this list of sins originally, he had 8. And it was Gregory the Great in the 4th century who conflated 2 of them into sloth. He conflated what Evagrius called acedia, excuse me, which essentially was a kind of apathy. And Gregory combined that with sadness, and came up with a sin of sloth. And it's interesting to look at the distinction between those 2 things. And also certainly how we have confronted them in our modern world and our attitudes towards them. But I really do think that it is more the sense of acedia, which is a kind of an apathy, a listlessness, what kids used to call the blahs, right? Where you just sort of have this just general malaise. And somebody like Paul Valéry and D.H. Lawrence, who I quote extensively in the book, they would really look at that as being a sort of a characteristic of our modern culture, that kind of spiritual malaise. It's something which they noticed as early as the turn of the 20th century, and it's something which we certainly, I think, are confronted with in even greater ways today.
Yeah, it's interesting to look back in the past and see the way in which it was defined, how it was conflated, and then to think about how it's kind of mixed messaging in the modern day. You mentioned you go in depth into how sadness can be depression and how it's mentioned in the DSM-5. And can you talk a little bit about the modern day depression versus what some people may think sloth was back then?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I'm not a psychologist, but but certainly it seems like that word depression is thrown around an awful lot in our world today. And we hear people say, "I'm depressed," quote unquote. And it isn't until you start to really look at what it means to be clinically depressed that you really start to understand what depression is all about. When people say I'm depressed, they more often mean that they've got that sense of just malaise and kind of blah. clinical depression is at a much greater and more powerful level. And it is certainly the case, and the studies show this constantly now, that the rates of depression in our culture are on the rise, especially amongst younger people and children. And it's important to understand what those studies are saying when they are using that word depression. Are they talking about clinical depression and how that is diagnosed? Or are they talking just about this sense of the blahs? We saw a lot of it through COVID, and now we're seeing the effects of it coming out of it, especially, as I say, with children.
Yeah, as you were talking, it got me thinking about modern day doctors who can diagnose people with depression. And then we go back to the Middle Ages, or when when the church was powerful, they too had the power to diagnose people. And while they may have had different remedies, they sometimes they worked for both of them. It's interesting how
Yeah,
those two have changed places
sure.
as the definition has.
And of course, the interpretation of what mental illness is, right, has changed so significantly, just even, my gosh, over the last probably 25 years, never mind 2000 years. In the Middle Ages, if someone were deemed mentally ill, in general in the Western world, it indicated that they were under the possession of the devil. And the resulting therapy, quote unquote, for that was to drill a hole in your head to let the demons escape, because the real concern was the salvation of your soul, your spiritual self. And if in the process your physical self died, well, that was okay, because you were saving the soul, which is the eternal part. And that attitude about the demons in our mind is something which we still use as a metaphor. But it's a powerful one. And as we've talked about before, I mean, the power of a metaphor and the power of symbols is not something to be sort of just shrugged off. It is significant. And it's interesting the way that the role of the cleric and the role of the physician have kind of played and intersected over the years. And really, there's been such a strong attempt in the West to separate them. And we don't see that as much, of course, in the East, or even in places like Native American religions, where the priest and the doctor are often the same person. It reminds me of, there's a in the closing act of Shakespeare's Hamlet, there's confusion because there is a figure there who in some texts is referred to as the priest and in others as the doctor, because he really is serving both roles. And the distinction between care for the physical self and care for the spiritual self is something which is relatively modern.
Yeah, there's so much in there that makes me think about just different topics. When we think of Acedia and we think of mental illness, it's not, to me, what comes to my mind is someone who has a lot of time on their hands, not because they're lazy, not because they're stupid or anything like that, just because maybe they have abundance, maybe. And so now that they almost create these problems in their mind, and whether it was back in the past, if it was a person of the court, or today maybe it's a daughter of say Paris Hilton or something like that, not that she is, but just saying someone that has so much stuff. It's I think you talked a little bit about the idle hands doing the devil's work.
Exactly. So, I mean, there is a point at which you can have too much time on your hands. And being thoughtful, rational human beings, we oftentimes then have that idle time and use that in order to explore things that perhaps might not be so good, to dwell on our problems, and to basically, as our grandparents and parents used to say, build mountains out of molehills, right? And make more of something than it might really be. But again, we fall into that trap again of Who's to say, right? Objective versus subjective, right? I mean, I can't get into your head and know what your pain is. I can never do that. Pain is not something which can be objectively assessed, as much as the health insurance companies wish it could be. Um, but it can't be. It is a purely subjective emotion, and the attempt to try to objectively assess someone's pain is really foolhardy. But nonetheless, because we are a data-driven society, we have something like the DSM, which will delineate, the characteristics of someone who is clinically depressed, and a physician, a practitioner, is able to check off a bunch of boxes on a form, and that will get you, the drugs that you need in order to feel better. But it is a curiosity of our modern life that, I mean, as you say, idle hands. But on the flip side, everyone seems so busy. How do we have any time to be like that? And so there's an interesting sort of conundrum there, where we live in a world that's so fast paced and so busy, and yet we often fall into the trap where we sort of sit back and say, what am I doing? What is this? What's going on here? Is what I'm doing really meaningful? Does it have any effect? And, I think that, as we've talked in other episodes, that sort of self-reflection is definitely a positive thing. The problem is that if you become so self-obsessed, and you fall into, the other sins of pride and things like that, that you can't get out of it, and you really then become unable to objectively view the world. Everything is seen only through your lens, and as a result, because you're having a bad day, everything is just a disaster. And I suppose that in some ways, folks who are plagued with this issue of sloth, and note, I'm not saying guilty of a sin, because I have a hard time thinking about it in those terms. The folks who are plagued with that, it's a very difficult thing to get out of. You really do get stuck in the mire, and that metaphor of your feet being stuck in the tar, and you can't move. But there is a point at which I think the writers would say that we can prevent that from happening, but it has to be active. It has to be an active effort at prevention on our part. Left untended, it can grow and really fester. And that's what a lot of the early writers, the early monks, particularly Benedict in his rule, that's what he's worried about with the monks, is that they're going to be sitting around. They're not going to have anything to do. They're going to just be kind of apathetic, and, oh, I don't care about this, and I don't want to do that. And from Benedict's perspective, that will possibly have them fall into some of the more serious sinful behavior.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I really think it depends on how you're wired sometimes. It seems like some of these sins, the people that fall the furthest have the opportunity to become our greatest heroes. There's nothing more engaging and more beautiful to me than the man or woman who should have never rose to the top because they had all these demons, or they were afflicted by so much. And then when you hear that story, like, I get goosebumps just thinking about it, because I know it's possible. And I'm a huge fan of Joseph Campbell, probably is probably the big reason, but I think that particular power dwells within every one of these sins, and especially sloth. Sloth is the ability, if your feet are stuck in the tar and you are being pushed down, what better way than to rise above, or find the courage, or to find God, or to find inspiration. It doesn't have to be God, but it can be any sort of power that you
Sure.
can harness. And then I think when that happens, it helps make you a whole person. And one way you talk about that is there's an interesting relationship between envy and sloth. Can you fill people in on that?
Yeah, well, they seem sort of opposites, don't they?
Yeah.
Sloth is I don't care about anything, and envy is I care about everything that you've got, and why don't I have that stuff?
Right.
And so they really do seem almost like polar opposites. And isn't it interesting that we live in a world in which we're kind of battling both of those issues? I mean, as we talked about last week, with social media, envy is at the forefront, and with sloth it can be as well. I mean, we I'm sure we all have Facebook friends, and I use friends in the loosest way possible, who are just guilty of that kind of sloth, that they live their entire existence on social media, and that I think is a slothful behavior, because as a lot of the intellectuals throughout time have told us, that the real indication of an active mind is engaging with other human beings, is exploration of the self, is a movement. And it doesn't even have to be a movement necessarily forward, right? You can move backwards too, but that movement, I mean, I think the danger is the stagnation, and the feeling that you're, again, that image of just stuck in the tar, and I can't move. I can't go forward. I can't go backward. And it's a horrifying image. And for folks who are really experiencing that in serious clinical depression, in terms of that, it can be incredibly painful to experience. Now, we're fortunate now that we have discovered enough about the brain that we understand some of the pathology about what goes on there, and that for many people who are experiencing this, it is a drug imbalance in the brain. It's a problem with the chemistry, and that can be, if not corrected, at least augmented, to the point where you can begin to feel better. But we also know that there are lots of people who experience this kind of depression, are put on medication, and either don't notice an immediate change, which we know it doesn't work that way. It takes, on average, I believe it's about 6 weeks for the meds to sort of level out your brain chemistry, or they stay on them and then they start to feel better, so they stop taking them.
Yeah.
Right. So that's, I've over the years always had students who've come in, who say, they weren't feeling good. They were depressed. Went to a therapist. They were diagnosed. They were put on Prozac or Lexapro or one of them, and they took it for a couple of months and they felt better. And then they come into me the next semester and they're not feeling so good. And I say, "So you still on your meds?" "No, I stopped taking them." "You know why?" "Well, I was feeling better." It's like, well, maybe you shouldn't stop taking them then.
Yeah.
But I part of this is also our ability to admit that we are not in total control. Part of this is, and I'm thinking about things like AA and the 12-step programs. That's one of the first things that you do, right? Is I can't control this, and there's something greater than me. And for a lot of people, the hesitancy against getting help, certainly against being put on medication, is either a sense of pride in that I should be better than this, I should be able to do this myself, or it's that sense of shame that if I do this, it means that I'm a failure because I couldn't cope on my own. When it's become very clear that for a large portion of folks who are struggling with this type of malady, it really is a brain chemistry issue. I think one of the greatest things that's happened in the last 50 years is that discovery at a meta level, that really, for a lot of people, it's just a misfunctioning brain chemistry. And luckily we have medicine that can correct that, but you got to take it. And I do think, for some folks, it's difficult to surrender yourself and to admit that, yes, I need to be on this medicine every day.
Yeah, it's difficult to admit that you have a problem, because then that means all these things in the past that you did might have been your fault. So it's not like you're admitting to this one thing in your
Right.
head. It's like, hey, everything in my life is my fault. That's
Yeah.
a tough pill to swallow. But I think I think all of us have to swallow that pill at some point in time, and it can be bitter, and sometimes you got to take them once a week, or
Yeah. Yeah.
once a day sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you allude to it, and I talk about this in other parts of the book, is our issue with the issue of responsibility, right?
Yeah.
About who's responsible for this. Am I responsible for my own behavior, or can I, perhaps in a way that might not be positive, blame it on, well, my brain chemistry is just screwed up. Now, if I'm depressed, I think that would be okay. We see this used a lot, though, now in the legal world, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not my fault. I'm not responsible because right? My brain chemistry is wrong, or and I think just there's a danger here. We've entered a time period in our history as a human species where we are really struggling with how much of what goes on in the world are we responsible for as human beings. I mean, if you just think about it think about climate change, right?
Yeah.
I mean, are we responsible for that? Hell yeah. Right? I mean, look at the studies. Look at the history, look at the facts. But it's difficult for us to take responsibility for that. And watching what's going on in Ukraine. I was watching a lot of the news last night. I happened to be watching a good deal of it last night. I've been trying to stay away from as much of it as I can of the cable news on this, because it's 24/7 and it's
Yeah.
unrelenting. But it is just ugly. And what are we going to do? Who's responsible for this? Who's responsible for stopping it? Which, of course, was a major question in World War II, right? I mean, who's responsible for stopping this? And I saw, I think it was early this morning, one of the higher government officials in Ukraine, not the president, but one of his next in line, was lamenting the fact that, where is Europe? They're not doing anything to help us. And these people are being destroyed. And so, I think we really do struggle with this question of who is responsible at that level, and also then just down at the level of the Good Samaritan, right?
Yeah.
And how I take care of my neighbor. Something as silly as, do I hold the door open for somebody? Just because that's a kind thing to do. But I feel that as a responsibility that's what makes us human.
Yeah, I agree. I think the answer is that we're all guilty of it. Like, all of us have played a role in this. And, be it apathy or ignorance, like, we're all guilty, and it doesn't feel good. And, there's so many moving parts, and there's so much death and destruction of innocent people that, like, it makes me want to cry.
Yeah.
I don't, and maybe that's part of the problem, is that it seems like such a big problem. People say, what can we do? And then no one does anything. But you're right. I think deciding to do something nice every day can have radical changes, not only in your life, but in somebody else's life. It's like that little pebble you throw in the pond, right? And it puts a little wave. But if everybody does that, I think that's how the world gets better, and if you hold the door open for somebody, there could be a little boy that sees that and is like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. And he does it forever because you did it. Like, the
yeah, I
things
mean,
that you
there's
do.
something about modeling behavior for
Yeah.
the next generation, but there's also I mean, I've said for my entire career, a pat on the back doesn't cost anything, right? I
Yep.
mean, just to say to somebody you did a good job, that doesn't cost anything. But it can make a big, big difference, right? I mean, we talk about all these morale issues at
Hmm.
corporations and in organizations, but a lot of it just comes down to, appreciating the job that people are doing when they are working hard. And I think the hope is that if you do that, then more people will work hard because they understand that they're going to be appreciated. I mean, if you're not appreciated, what's the motivation? Yes, it sounds great to say, well, it's just the feeling of doing a good job, and that sounds wonderful. But the reality is, we want some kind of affirmation, right? We want external affirmation. Um, and I mean, it can come down to, just as I say, somebody just sending an email and saying, I saw what you did today, and that was great. You know, glad you're here. And that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it reminds me. I was talking to Dr. Thomas Verney the other day, who wrote a book called The Embodied Mind, and it gets into epigenetics. And I'll just give you this one little tidbit from it. The idea of Schrodinger's cat, how if you
Sure.
observe something, it changes, right?
Yep.
He makes the claim in his book that what you're seeing now is we know that when you observe something, it fundamentally changes. So what has been the fallout, it's the wrong word, what has been the repercussions of all of us beginning to look at ourselves and observe ourselves? And he goes in depth in it, and I think it's a profound statement because it brings together some of the 7 deadly sins, but it also brings together the idea of observation, maybe a greater power watching us, and some of the Eastern tradition. And if you look at the radical change that's happening in our world, you could make the argument that it is because so many people are beginning to self-reflect, with just the little soliloquy right there that we had about what we can do. Hey, here's what I've done. Here's what I think. Like,
Yeah.
just us talking about observing ourselves is going to have a shift. If 1 or 2 people see this, or I mean, I bet you all your students are better people because you're their teacher. You have
Thank
a
you.
great observation and you're always there for people. I think
Yeah.
that you're making the world better. And this
Well,
idea of observing is
it's
better.
about being self-aware,
Yes.
right? And then encouraging others to be self-aware. And I think that is something that we have largely lost in recent years, is that self-awareness. We become so focused on the external that we've neglected the internal. We obsess about what's exterior and neglect the interior, and that's just a lot of this is just getting back to old practices, right? But the problem is today, of course, we've got so many other things complicating it, and our world is so much more complicated. I was talking with my students the other day about Thomas Aquinas and talking about his literary output, which was monumental. I mean, oh my God, did this guy write? And it was just like, as much as he wrote, you wonder, what else did he do? But he did a lot. And it's almost this kind of thing where you talk about him and then you say, and what did you do today? Because I think that we have fallen into that kind of slothful behavior, whereby we, at the end of the day, when I assess what I did today, and I do that just about every day, and I think most people do, it can be a really enriching and positive experience, or it can be pretty miserable, and you realize, you know what, I didn't do anything today. I sat around and binge watched something on Netflix, and that was the extent of my output. My literary output for the day was writing down on a piece of paper, or get milk and buy bread. But if we fall into the trap of that kind of behavior, we have to be active. We have to be moving. We have to be engaging with others. that is part of what makes us human beings. And I just, now I say that as an extrovert. I understand introverts have a completely different take on this. Something which I've been trying to appreciate. My wife is an introvert, but I really struggle with it because even when we were during the lockdown at the beginning of COVID, and I was working from home, oh my, I mean, it just drove me nuts. And every day I had to go out and get in the car and just drive to the convenience store to get a soda because I had to see other people. But that's me as an extrovert. So I think that people engage maybe in different ways. And I think folks who are introverts also engage just in a different way that's not as obvious as it is for an extrovert where, well, I want to be around people. But boy, and of course the extrovert introvert thing goes, I mean, it all grows out of Jungian psychology and psychological types and the looking at your various characteristics. But it just seems to me that we are social beings.
It reminds me of, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
There's one of the funniest quotes from a very funny individual. I have it written down, but I should let you read it because it's a beautiful quote from Woody Allen. Did you have it on you right there?
Which one is it? The one about the shark?
It is the one about the shark.
Yeah. So this is at the end of Annie Hall.
Yes, yes.
When they are flying back on the plane, he and Diane Keaton as Annie Hall, and he says to her that basically it seems like the whole relationship has stalled, and he makes the analogy that relationships are like sharks, and sharks always have to be moving in order to remain alive. And I think the line is, what we have on our hands is a dead shark. Is that what he said?
It is, yeah.
And I think that there's something to that. There's something to the and this is what the monks were afraid of with Acedia, is that you were just going to basically stagnate. You weren't going to do anything. And that's why Benedict in his rule devises a program of work and prayer, right? That the monks needed to engage in. It was a balance. It wasn't just all prayer. They had to work too. So you had to be active. And, that might mean, raising sheep. It might mean baking bread. It might mean whatever the case may be. But there needed to be both, because he understood that we are spiritual and physical beings, both. We can't only focus on the spiritual because we're neglecting a whole part of what we are. And I think that in Eastern philosophy, I think you see this as well. You see it in the Upanishads, you see it in the writings about the Buddha, and the fact that, yes, it is important to reflect and meditate, but it is also just as important to be active physically. And even if that's just, the monastic practice in a lot of Eastern temples of just walking, literally walking just back and forth while you are meditating and praying, but you are moving. In the Jewish synagogue, I remember when I was a kid, we attended an ultra conservative synagogue, and the old men, when they prayed standing up, would rock. It was called davening. And there was something to that. I never really understood what that was all about. I was like, why are they doing that? And I thought, well, maybe it's because there's a chanting going on. And maybe it was something about keeping rhythm. No, it wasn't that. It was more about that movement, about feeling that being alive, because that's the only way you feel it.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's the mind-body connection. They have to work together. Sometimes I feel when you write stuff down or when you're exercising and thinking, it's like your body is giving permission to your mind to finish the thought.
Yeah, that's an excellent way to put it. Yeah, excellent way to put it.
Yeah,
And
it's
I have an absolutely brilliant student right now who's graduating in a couple of weeks, who has been working on a long-term project with me on Jung and Augustine, and
oh,
she's writing actually about the mind body, specifically about that and the connection between the two in both of their writings.
I can't wait to read it.
Yeah.
That's so awesome. It must be really rewarding to get to work with young minds that are curious and agile and full of vigor.
Absolutely is. Absolutely. And who are eager to learn.
Yes,
That is just such an absolute treat.
that is.
And just, I always say that the active mind is active always, right? Um, in all ways and always. And so that just that yearning and desire to learn, which is what I mean, education, that's what we kind of get off on, right? Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, that brings me to one of your quotes from William Blake that says, "The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. He who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. The
yeah,
busy bee has no time for sorrow."
yeah. And there's also a line about expect poison from stagnant water,
Yeah, that's a good
right?
one. Can you maybe tell the people like how many different directions you can go from that little
Yeah, so
analogy?
it's all about, if I mean, Blake was brilliant on these sort
Right.
of one-line aphorisms.
Yeah.
Expect poison from standing water. If you just think about that, I mean, it is a truth, right? I mean, if you are hiking, and being a Bronx from the Jew, I don't hike, but if you are hiking, and you need to find some water, I mean, you do not drink from stagnant water because it could be potentially poisonous. Running water as opposed to stagnant water. But then, of course, the metaphor of, we just need to be active and moving. And I think it's interesting that these quotes oftentimes come from these minds who were anything but stagnant.
Yeah.
I mean, just incredibly active minds. It's really just amazing. And the more that I study some of these folks, the more that I just marvel at what they were able to accomplish, and reflect on, how did they do it? How did they find the time and the energy to be able to accomplish what they did? I mean, I study Carl Jung. I mean, his collected works is, I think, 22 volumes, and that doesn't even include everything.
Yeah.
Just the notes from his seminar on Nietzsche run to about 800 pages. It's just incredible. And then the man still had time to paint,
Yeah.
to draw, and to build his house in Bollingen. It's just incredible. I don't know. I don't know how they did it. Um, I don't know how they did it. And we read about them, and um, I don't know. I've been reading a memoir of Paul Valery, a short little piece written by Igor Stravinsky, of all people, whose his path overlapped with Valerie's at one point. And so he wrote this short 5-page memoir about Valery. It seems, as those often are, to be more about Stravinsky than it is about Valery, but he's talking about, how he would run into him, and he initially says, I don't know how our paths hadn't crossed prior to this point. And it's quite interesting to see the way that some of these folks historically, some of these intellectuals, how their paths overlapped and intersected in very almost serendipitous ways, and again, that's one of the, I mean, I never would have met George Monty if it weren't for the fact that I'd written this book, and
All
my
right.
my publicist, contacted me about being on the podcast, and but and that has enriched my life now.
Yeah, me too.
And so I think if we look at the serendipity of our existence, oftentimes we can celebrate that. And if we get too hung up on everything needs to be planned and regimented and timed out, my gosh, then you're never going to have the joy of just an accidental meeting with somebody.
Yeah, it's like in the mystic traditions, they say, if you're ready, the teacher will appear.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's interesting to think about it. Speaking of Carl Jung, he had an interesting take on sloth as almost a gateway drug.
Yeah. He was concerned that kind of behavior was going to result in other negative behaviors. Particularly, he's I think thinking about lust. But one of my favorite quotes from Jung is in the conclusion to the book, which we'll talk about next week, where he says it's almost ridiculous prejudice to assume that existence can only be physical.
Wow, that's a deep
I love that quote because it for me encapsulates just so much of what I believe and what I've worked on, and this idea that the only thing that we can actually understand is the physical universe, and that's all there is, just seems foolhardy to me. I was reading something this morning, and someone was reflecting about the fact. Oh, it was a review of Jennifer Egan's new book, The Candy House, I think it's called, her new novel, and she was talking about the fact that she had a dream about someone that she knew, and I believe then she realized that day that the person had died 2 days earlier.
Wow.
And so there's a lot that goes on in the universe that we don't understand, that exists in just this spiritual ether. And for my students who initially come in very skeptical about that, I have a very easy exercise that I have them do. I have one student on one side of the room call another student on another side of the room on their cell phone and say, how did that work? So there's no magic? Because that seems magical to me.
Yeah.
And so they start to think about, oh, well, wait a minute. So we've got these two physical things, these two cell phones, but they never touched each other. They're not connected. How did that work? And so to start to encourage them to think about some more of the mysteries of existence, the things that as you say, the mystics were really interested in, the things that I think we're all interested in. Even those who work in the physical sciences are still interested in those. Some of the most spiritual people I know are actually physicists.
Yeah.
Which seems just oxymoronic, but it's true. I know there's a professional organization for Catholic chemists. I know that organization exists, and I'm sure that there are others. So it seems inconsistent to have that kind of belief and then subscribe to the laws of the physical universe. But it is, again, part of that sort of acknowledgement that there's a physical existence and there's a spiritual existence, and that both of them are really what make the world go round.
Yeah, I read a little blurb. I got to look more into it, but there's some just mind-blowing work with this guy Hammeroff and then Roger Penrose that are talking about microtubule. I think I'm saying that right, microtubuleros or something, and it's like these. It's based on the idea of quantum mechanics, but they're like these tiny little tubules that people communicate with trees and rocks and plants, and it's the reason why if you have a dream, something happened to your friend, you're connected in this right. Spiritual way. It's just probably another way to describe spiritual connection, but it's still fascinating to think about all these ways. It makes me realize maybe we are kind of like actual sloths. We just don't understand yet. We're kind of in the trees still.
Well, yeah, and that, of course, is the interesting thing about this sin of sloth is when I started writing about this, a friend of mine sent me an email with a picture of a sloth. Here you go. And so I looked at that one day when I was working on this chapter, and I was like, why do we call them sloths? What the heck is going on there? And so I actually looked into it a little bit to figure out, well, what is the history of the sloth, and discovered some interesting things about them, which is that they actually conserve energy by moving that slowly. That they can actually move rather quickly in the water when they have to. And I think that, we look at them and we look down at them and think about it as a negative thing. We talk about sloth as a negative thing. But maybe, we are like the sloth sitting up in the tree, just trying to figure it all out. I mean, some of us would aspire to have that kind of time on our hands. Although I don't know if it necessarily would be a good thing. But I know, when I stopped teaching full time and took this position where I am now, which is largely administrative, I used to joke and say, I just want to be able to sit around all day and just read, Valerie and Andre Gide and all these, I just want to be able to do just for the heck of it.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that the other day because, I do that some of the time, but I'm certainly incredibly busy with the rest of the time, and I don't think it's my nature to just sit and do that 24/7. I don't think I could get away with that. And part of it is my extroverted personality and my need to engage with other human beings. But I certainly know plenty of scholars who do that just 24/7. They exist in their minds, and for some of them, I think it could be a beautiful place. For others, it might not be. But it's funny. I showed an image the other day. I was doing a workshop for students on graduate school, and we were talking about letters of recommendation and why it's so important to get good letters of recommendation from people who really know you. And you can find it on the internet. There's a great letter of recommendation that was written for the mathematician John Nash, A Beautiful Mind. And it's written on an index card, and it says something to the effect of, I've known him since he was 19. He's a mathematical genius. It's like 3 lines. That's all it says. And it amazes me that somebody like John Nash, somebody like Einstein, some of these scientific thinkers in particular of the first half of the 20th century, who were able to grasp the meaning of existence and the universe and put it into terms that were mathematical, that could make some sense out of things in a rational way. I love the story about Einstein being in Princeton, and they used to have a graduate student follow him around because he had a habit when he was walking around of just when something would occur to him, he would just dodge into an empty classroom and scribble a bunch of formulas on the board. And so they had a graduate student following him around to copy all that down. But there's also a great story about Einstein in Princeton walking down Nassau Street eating an ice cream cone, and the ice cream dripping down his hand because he's so inside his own head that he's forgotten that he's got the ice cream cone in his hand. Someone used to joke that they thought that should be the statue to Einstein in downtown Princeton, because there's the quintessential absent-minded professor.
Yeah, it seems there's an interesting relationship with people that have fundamentally changed the world, whether it's philosophers being in prison, or mathematicians eating ice cream cones, or mathematicians running down the street after their bath naked. There's quite a few interesting, but I think that's part of it, right? You have to see the world different in order to be able to relay it in a way that makes sense in your head first before you can give it to someone else.
Well, it's why I tell my students that, all research involves creativity, and all creativity involves research, right? I mean, they're both. And I think folks think that if you are involved in research, they think about it as being very mechanical and there's no creativity involved. But I mean, when you are working, and for listeners who work in the hard sciences, if you're working in a microbiology lab, you can't tell me that there's not some creativity that's going to be involved in the work that you do. It isn't just mechanical. If it were, then quite honestly, anybody could do it. Just write down the instructions and they'll do it. But there is something to research that is creative, very much, and there certainly is a lot of creativity that a lot of research that goes into creativity as well. I know novelist friends. People think that when folks write novels, it's all about inspiration, right? You sit at the computer and you wait for the clouds to open and the bright light to appear. But the reality is, if you speak to most novelists, there's a lot of research that goes into their books. I had a friend I used to teach with who had written a novel. It was a Western novel. And for a semester, he actually had gone to Germany because one scene in the book was to take place in Germany, and he'd never been. And the thing was that for some reason, I don't know why, German culture has always been really kind of intrigued by the stories of the Old West in the U.S. And so he went over there to explore that. And it was an incredible research trip, and it changed the book. Probably made the book, I'm sure it made the book better. But there was a tremendous amount of research that went into this creative pursuit of writing a novel.
Yeah, it seems to, I know it's happened to me on both sides where, if you're sitting around in a group or something brainstorming, or you've worked together with these people for a long time, a lot of the times it's difficult to come up with a new idea until you bring in someone new to the group. That,
Sure.
if you work for, say, I don't know, some organization, and you guys are all collaborating, you work well together, everyone gets along, it gets kind of stale. You got to bring in someone who knows nothing about it, or who may know something but has never studied with you, or vice
Someone to
versa.
shake it
You
up.
can be that person.
Yeah, someone to shake things up. Somebody who's got a new perspective. I'll often talk about, bring in somebody else who doesn't have a stake in this and see what they have to say, right? Because oftentimes you end up in an echo chamber otherwise.
Yeah.
Right. And you can't hear anything new, but you open the door and let somebody new in, and oftentimes they'll bring a very different perspective to the table. We were just talking about this last night in my museum studies course, because talking about the fact that in the museum world, it's so important to have all the different players at a museum involved in projects. So it's not just about the curators curating an exhibit. You also should have folks there from fundraising, and folks there from patron services, and folks there who, run the shop. I mean, all of that. It's important to all be on the same page and contribute something, because those folks are going to see something that you probably wouldn't, because you're not used to thinking in that way.
Yeah, I agree. To bring it back just to sloth here before we finish up,
Sure.
like what part? I think there's two good parts I want to cover. One is how Socrates feared the effects of writing on memory.
Yeah.
Then there was the death of the scribe and the evils of the printing press. And can you talk about how that relates to sloth?
Yeah, well, it's this attitude again towards technology. And remember, technology doesn't necessarily have to mean computers and cell phones.
Right.
Right. I mean, for Socrates, I mean, it was a technology, the invention of writing. And if we think about technology in that sense, right, think about the Greek meaning of the word technology, and explore what somebody like Heidegger has to say about it in his brilliant essay on it. It's a connection for Socrates to memory, and the fact that if we are offloading a lot of the responsibility for memory onto the technology, he was worried about what that was going to do to us. And I think the interesting bookend to that is an essay that we've talked about before by Vannevar Bush, the As We May Think, written in 1945, where Bush basically predicted the internet and the desktop computer, And his attitude about it was, yes, we are going to offload our memory onto this technology. And that is a good thing. It will free our minds to do the higher level thinking that human beings are capable of. And the great lament in the now, what, 60, more than 60 years since Bush wrote that essay is, we have done that, but we haven't really engaged with that higher level thinking. And instead we are, forgive me for saying it, pissing a lot of it away. We're not using it the way that we could and the way that we should. We're not taking advantage of it. And I think this is, a callback to what Socrates was really worried about, is that by doing this, we were going to really damage our ability to remember things. Now, Bush, so many years later says, okay, that's a good thing. We don't need to remember this. I don't need to know all these dates. I can easily look those up on a computer, right? I mean, that's why I never quiz my students on dates. I think it's the dumbest thing to have people remember. I mean, sure, there are certain things, dates that you want people to know, important dates. But in general, to know specific dates of things it's really not necessary, because we can look it up just at the snap of a finger. But the benefit of that is, what are you going to do with that ability now in your mind? So we've cleared out that space, metaphorically, right? You don't need to have space to remember those dates anymore. How are you going to use that space? What are you going to do with it? And I don't think we figured that out yet as a species. What are we going to do with that, and how to best do it? We talk a lot about approaching the singularity, right? Where we'll be able to download our minds to a computer, and then at a later date upload our minds to a new human body or a restored human body. It's an interesting idea, and it's interesting for technology. But from the philosophical perspective, I think the question is, to what end? What's the point? Why? Why would you want to do that? What would be the purpose of it? What would be the use? And many of our technological advances go along with that. I mean, in the chapter on sloth, I talk about how in the 1950s, when the remote control was introduced, right? The TV remote control, which, initially it was looked at as like, this is, I forget what it was called in the ads. It was actually referred to with a euphemism as being, let me find it here. I'm sorry. Here it is. Lazy bones. They were called lazy bones, right? The advertisement in 1951 called it miraculous. But then by the time we got to 2012, when the inventor of the first wireless remote control died, in his obituary in the Washington Post, it noted that sometimes people blamed the remote control for contributing to obesity. So, positives and negatives, right? And how do we balance that out? And certainly with a lot of technology, I still think we struggle with that. How do we find the balance? How do we find the middle way, right? The middle way that the mystics wanted us to find, right? How do we find that?
It makes me wonder if, instead of us clearing up space by downloading stuff onto the computer, is it possible that, like, if the brain is a muscle, maybe you need to build that memory so that you can have higher order thinking? Maybe we have went ahead and eliminated our ability to have higher level thinking, to be like Carl Jung, because we can't pass the first step anymore.
Sure.
And you look at stuff like the brain chip, like, okay, we're just going to try to put back in our head what we already had, but only it's a computer version, it's like
no, I think you're right. I mean, and the sort of cultural obsession with downloading apps to your phone that are brain games, right? To keep your brain active, right? I mean, it just seems, it's just a kind of funny thing, isn't it? When you think about it. But I do think that there is something to that. And certainly there are lots of writers in the Middle Ages in particular, and it's going into the early years of the Renaissance, who are really concerned with our not only our ability to retain things and have memory, but our potential loss of that.
Mm.
The great medieval scholar Mary Carruthers wrote several really good books on this, on memory, particularly in medieval thought, and how really we just changed our idea of what that was all about, moving from a kind of faculty psychology idea where memory lived in one section of your brain, literally, to understanding that it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, there's another interesting. I heard Peter Thiel talking about technology. Him and I think it was Eric Weinstein. They were talking about, we have all these ideas about technology and how great it is and how advanced we are. But they made the claim, if you just took out every screen out of your room, be it a phone, a tablet, or a computer, that room would look the same as it did in 1950. So
Yeah.
really, we've talked about technology, but where is it?
Yeah. Well, yeah. You're right. I mean, I'm just looking around my own office here when you say that, and yeah, you're right. I mean, I've got my phone sitting here and my computer, but other than that, I have a bunch of lamps. I mean, there really isn't any other technology in this room in the way that we think of technology today. Of course, electricity itself is a technology.
Sure.
But yeah, you're right. The way that it has sort of insidiously crept into our lives now with smartphones and smartwatches and these wearable devices, is interesting. I mean, I remember when Google Glasses came out several years ago.
Yeah.
And it was a horrible disaster because they were terrible. Because who wants to be on the internet 24/7 like that? And that's what it was basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we talk about sloth, but like you've done a really good job of equating the world of online living and the world of technology, and how there are some very dangerous aspects of that. And I think in this chapter you do a good job of linking sloth to it, like be it memory or be it people in a slothful behavior looking online and other people who are in a slothful behavior being envy of that. It's just a sloth world.
Yeah, I mean, I see my friends who are on vacation, and I'm, why can't I be on vacation? And
Well, you're sitting
what are
around
they
doing
doing? I see pictures of their feet because they're laying on the beach and taking pictures and posting it on Instagram.
It's so ridiculous.
It's such a strange phenomena.
Oh, that is. Well, Doctor, I want to be mindful of your time. Do you want to leave us with anything else? We got next week coming up, but
next week
what else can you leave us with?
wrap up with a conclusion on the whole thing and try to come up with a positive message for the future on all this.
Yeah. And what do you have a blog coming up that you're going to talk about something?
I do. I'll have a blog coming out probably in about a week and a half.
Nice.
It will be posting a new blog, and it will be about a lot of these issues about really where the blog comes from is the statement that we hear so often, which is no one reads anymore.
Nice.
And what does that mean?
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to it. Okay, Doctor. Well, that's it for this week, everybody. Thank you for watching and listening. And you can see all of Dr. David Salomon's links in the show notes below. And reach out to him. And we'll be back next week to do it again. Aloha.
Thanks, George.